Hello and welcome to Reportage with Danish bin Nabi. I am today joined by an expert on conflict resolution, peace building, and security of the Muslim world, Mr. Zahid Shahab Ahmed from Deakin University, Australia. I shall be asking him about the Iranian influence in Middle East and Saudi-Iran rivalry. Mr. Zahid, warm welcome to you. Mr. Zahid, some of the countries lately Muslim countries, I must say, lately have started to recognize the state of Israel. How is this going to impact the power politics in Middle East?
This is a very important question because what is happening in the Middle East with reference to the normalization of relations between, let's say, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and it's not happening without the approval of Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia has also permitted the use of its airspace for the Israeli planes, which is very unprecedented move considering the context also that for the past 3 years there is the Qatar blockade. So we have on the one side the blockade of a Muslim country. On the other hand, we see this normalization of the relations between the mainly the Gulf countries. Of course, there is Sudan as well, which has also recognized Israel, but mainly because they wanted to get rid of the US sanctions or international sanctions that were placed on Sudan for a long time. But here we are talking about very rich, oil-rich Muslim economies who have normalized their relations. And of course, here one key aspect or key convergence between Israel and these Gulf countries is the fact that they all have conflicting relations with Iran, and which has brought them together under, of course, the patronage of the United States, because Trump's son-in-law, he has been actually mediating between the Gulf countries and Israel, and recently has also been mediating between Doha and Riyadh and also Abu Dhabi. The implications are going to be far greater, not only for the region, considering their conflicting relations with Iran, but also beyond the Middle East. Implications for South Asia and beyond. I think we have to just wait and see how other countries are going to readjust their foreign policies.
You talked about Iran. Iran is an important player in that region. How is all this going to affect the Iranian nation?
I think it must have increased for Iran a lot more insecurities. Of course, their conflict with Israel is nothing new. Their competition with Saudi Arabia is nothing new. They have territorial disputes with the UAE over 2 to 3 islands, and those are not new as well. What is new is, of course, all these countries, which, of course, I don't think so Iran would have predicted, let's say, a decade ago, that these Arab states would normalize their relations with Israel. But I think this was like the writing on the wall, considering what was happening for the past many years in relation to, of course, the role of the Trump administration, but also how these Arab states were moving closer towards Israel in many different ways. There were already, reports of Saudi plane being spotted in Israel. A couple of years ago, there were talks of some negotiations happening behind the curtains. So I don't think so this would have been a complete surprise for Iran. Of course, this has increased the insecurities because you look at, it's not just the cooperation with Israel of the Arab states. It's also how, because of this agreement, which is called the Abraham Peace Accords, they have led to multi-billion-dollar, for example, defense deals involving the US and the UAE. The UAE is going to buy, those fighter planes, which I don't think so any other country than Israel has in the region. So while all this is happening in that context, when these countries are modernizing their militaries, of course, this has greater implications for Iran, considering what happened at the beginning of the year with regard to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. We now had another assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists. So, of course, I think Iran has increasingly been pushed against the wall. And, of course, it's now looking at other possibilities of cooperation.
Let's deviate a bit. We will come back to Iran in detail. First, let's talk about Pakistan. Pakistan being an important player, the only nuclear power in the Muslim world. There are reports that they are pressurizing Pakistan as well through one of the friendly countries, as they say. How do you see such developments?
I think, even if they are not directly pressurizing Pakistan, Pakistan is psychologically pressurized. Considering how rigid Pakistan has its position on the issue of Palestine, Pakistan is home to the biggest Palestinian embassy in the world. It has for a very long time supported the Palestinian cause, which is, like it's not very different to its identity politics and how that identity plays a role in Pakistan's foreign affairs. Pakistan's, for example, concerns on the issue of Jammu and Kashmir are closely aligned to its policy on the issue of
And
Palestine.
what if they recognize Israel somehow? How is that going to impact the relations between Iran and Pakistan then?
I don't think so. Pakistan is going to recognize Israel anytime in near future because, of course, it's linked to also Pakistan's long-standing position on the issue of Muslim minorities in other parts of the world. So, what would be Pakistan's, who would take Pakistan seriously then when Pakistan would talk about, for example, the Rohingyas issue or Jammu and Kashmir or Islamophobia in the West and so on, and especially the issue of Palestine. I think is very, very important. Despite the fact that these Arab states might have been pressurizing Pakistan, this pressure is not new. Pakistan was pressurized to send troops for the Saudi-led coalition to fight against Yemen. Pakistan's troops are not participating in the war, although the coalition is led by the former Pakistani general. Although there are always 10 to 15,000 Pakistani troops in Saudi Arabia, but they are not engaged in this war, considering also the delicate sectarian dynamic at home. Pakistan has the second largest Shia population after Iran. So the sensitivities are very high. Pakistan does not or cannot afford also to have to engage in other wars while there is, of course, insecurities in the region in South Asia. So considering that also, I don't think so. It's going to be easy for any government in Pakistan to even talk about the possibility of recognizing Israel. There is another, domestic factor in Pakistan. Although these Islamist groups, they do not have much of a vote bank, but their street power, their ability to mobilize people and bring them to the streets is much bigger than any other political actor in the country. So I don't think so any government would take an unnecessary sort of risk to even talk about negotiating with Israel.
By next January, end of January, we will see a new administration in the White House. How is Biden going to mend its relations with the Iran after the killing of nuclear scientist and the general?
I don't think so. The U.S. position is going to change very quickly as soon as there is the change of administration. Administrations usually take a while to understand the dynamics and to reformulate the policies if that is in the interest of the country. In this case, when Biden comes, the dynamics in the US are very different. The pandemic already is, breaking all global records in terms of infections per day, in terms of now casualties per day in the US. So I think his first challenge is going to be to tackle those domestic issues. Maybe he'll take another year or so to think of the foreign policy. I don't think so. He's, closer to the region. We talk about the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan and other places. I think he's going to stay with what Trump has or Trump administration has already decided. I don't think so. He will take a complete U-turn on the current administration's position on Iran. Of course, there can be possibilities of, for example, reviving the P5 plus agreement involving Iran and the nuclear installations there. I think that's as far as I think Biden administration will go in near future in coming 2 to 3 years. Then a lot is also dependent on how Tehran is going to approach the new administration. It's never been one-sided. And I think considering how politics works in Iran and what kind of regime is there, uh, you can never really be so sure how they are going to negotiate with the new government in the United States.
If we talk of Iran, since 2010, six nuclear scientists, including Mohsen Fakhrizad, have been killed, and as per reports, killed by the Mossad. Is it the failure of Iranian agencies to protect its assets?
Definitely, it's failure on that part. Considering because as a Pakistani, I know how Pakistan protects its nuclear scientists and technologies and all that. And Iran has similar kind of capabilities. Iran is a very, is not a weak state by that means, considering the capacity of its security forces. So considering that, it can be counted as a failure of its intelligence first, and the second, the failure of its security for its nuclear scientists. Looking at this recent assassination, I don't think so. This scientist was provided any security the way this incident happened. And if I compare it with nuclear scientists in Pakistan, there's a huge difference in terms of the level of the security provided by Iran and the level of security provided by Pakistan or any other country to its nuclear scientists, because they play a very crucial role in the development of nuclear weapons and also in maintaining any country's capacity to, let's say, engage in a nuclear war.
And the Iranians do not have fixed the responsibility since 2010.
In terms of responsibility, again, the way Iranian regime works, there is the supreme leader, then there is the parliament, which can, manage some affairs, but not all the affairs. I don't think so. The supreme leader is ever going to accept the responsibility that there was insufficient security provided to the nuclear scientists, because that will have negative implications for also other scientists working in Iran's nuclear installations. For any country, I don't think so. It's an easy matter to accept your own mistakes.
And how close is Iran in getting a nuclear bomb?
There are, of course, different estimates about this, some very exaggerated from Israel, that Iran is very, very close to having nuclear capability. If you look at independent reports, they suggest that Iran has the capability, if it keeps on the same track, and if there are no sort of checks and balances, let's say, and the operations are run smoothly, then it will acquire nuclear technology in no time. That was the whole idea of this European Union, agreement on Iran, because they wanted to establish checks and balances in return for lifting the sanctions on Iran. But then the Trump administration completely sort of destroyed that agreement or achievement. And now I think Iran has this, free space to move on with the development of its nuclear technology, because I think Iranians would think that the negotiations with the international community have completely failed. They have this Israeli threat, ever-growing Israeli threat, now involving other Arab countries from the Gulf as well. So while the threat is growing, how Iran can protect itself without using this nuclear deterrence? So I think from their logic, they would be at the moment, I think, really rushing towards the development of a nuclear technology. Answer to your question, that how close they are to that, I don't think so anyone can give you a clear answer.
We have seen how they killed the Qasem Soleimani, the general. Are there any chances Israel striking the nuclear plants of Iran?
There have always been these threats in, countries like Iran and Pakistan, for example. The nuclear installations can be attacked. If Israel really wanted to attack them and really could, they could have done it by now. I don't think so it's that easy, because that would, trigger a full-scale war in itself. And I don't think so Israel and Iran, they want that at this stage. I don't think so. That is the understanding. A full-scale war. Iran is not a small country by any mean, considering it's also the strength of its military. So I don't think so. Like it's not like other small countries that went against Israel for a war, let's say in the 60s. Iran has a far greater capability, and now the geopolitical environment is changing as well. Why would China, for example, promise an investment of $400 billion in Iran if there were, like if they would have thought that there would be more insecurities, or if Iran would be attacked by the US or other countries? I don't think so. Anyone wants a full-scale war at this stage.
Tell us about what are the chances of Saudi hand in killing of Qasem Soleimani and Mohsen Fakhrizad?
I don't think so. There's any Saudi hand in it. Or considering also the capacity of Saudi intelligence and the military, and the past record also. Of course, there are allegations in relation to the killing of Khashoggi, but that's a whole different case because he was a Saudi journalist. He went into a Saudi embassy and so on. Here we are talking about operation in a third country, enemy country. You have to rely a lot on your own intelligence and your own operatives. In this case, I think there would have been multiple operatives in Iran, and Saudis are known to have this capacity to lodge this kind of an attack in a third country. I would be completely surprised if there would ever be this case in coming 10 to 20 years. But of course, they are modernizing their weapons at this stage, being I think first or second in terms of weapon imports, close to India in terms of the ranking in the weapon imports. But their intelligence, they still rely a lot on other countries for security support. For US, for example, US has always been a key actor in terms of security in the region. For Pakistan to provide training to their armed forces in Saudi Arabia and also other Gulf countries, they don't have the capacity. There's only one country in the region that has the capacity to launch such attacks. It's Israel. And who else would be benefited from this kind of an attack? Okay, if you talk about direct beneficiaries, Israel has always seen Iran's nuclear development as a threat to Israel's security. Of course, it would indirectly benefit other Arab countries as well. But the direct beneficiary of such an attack is, of course, Israel.
This brings me to the last segment of my interview about the Saudi-Iran rivalry. Explain to me how ousting of Saddam Hussein in 2003 has changed the entire dynamics of Saudi-Iran rivalry. Because we have seen it was only after May 2003, once Saddam was out of the scene, that things have started to go downstairs in the Middle East, especially with the context of Shia-Sunni conflict.
In terms of the sectarian dynamic of the conflict, it's not new. The sectarian dynamic, especially since the start of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the sectarian dynamic was there. Prior to that, one can say that the sectarianism or the ideological nature of the conflict wasn't that visible. You are right that the post 9/11 context has added more insecurities. The Arab Spring and how Iran saw in it geopolitical opportunities. Iran has, some role in the Middle East. If you talk about Lebanon, you talk about Yemen, you talk about Syria, Iran has been engaged there. I think the current conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia is more of a geopolitical nature in the Middle East than it's ideological. Of course, you will find so many authors who have written about it that it's a Shia-Sunni conflict. But if you look at the ground realities are that it's much more than that. It's a geopolitical struggle for influence. Iran for long has been questioning, for example, Saudi Arabia's leadership of the Ummah. Iran has questioned Saudi Arabia's ability to manage Hajj even. or Mecca and Medina, the two holiest cities for the Muslims, there is this natural sort of contest for more influence and the leadership, because Iran is considered to be the center of Shia Islam, and Saudi Arabia for Sunni Islam. So there is this, I would say, psychological kind of competition. But if you talk about what's happening in Syria and how Iran is supporting, the Assad regime, what is happening in Yemen, and how Houthis are considered to be Iran's proxy, Hezbollah is considered to be Iran's proxy, and so on. It's more of a geopolitical struggle for influence in which Saudi Arabia is the next big actor, and it has decided to react. And we have seen in Yemen how it has reacted. And the geopolitical struggle for influence, I don't think so, is not going to end very soon. Despite the fact that there are also ideological dimensions, but we see ideological dimensions of the conflict more visible in countries like Pakistan, where during the Afghan Soviet jihad, Saudi Arabia provided funding for the establishment of Sunni madrasas, and that funding has ever continued. Then, since the Islamic Revolution, Iran also started to export its revolution to other parts of the Muslim world, and then Shia madrasas also came up. But that's more visible in, let's say, Afghanistan and Pakistan than in the Middle East, where it's purely a geopolitical struggle for influence.
Last year, Turkey, Iran, and Malaysia came up with another bloc parallel to OIC. How does that fit in all the scheme of things?
A lot would have been changed if Imran Khan would have gone to the meeting in Kuala Lumpur, but he came under pressure and he could not go. So we are talking about the biggest Muslim country, which is Indonesia, and the second Muslim country, which is Pakistan, not joining, that kind of a bloc at that stage last year.
But there were two representatives from the state of Pakistan that attended that meeting.
I think the head of the state is always an important person. From other countries, we had the heads of states going to the meeting. Of course, Imran Khan was also going to attend, but there was pressure from Saudi Arabia, and Riyadh actually viewed that as a threat to its leadership of the Ummah, because it controls, of course, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It has a greater influence on the Arab League. It has, of course, it is the key actor in the Gulf Cooperation Council as well. So if we talk about these international organizations, then you cannot get anything going without the approval of Saudi Arabia. Pakistan faced a lot of difficulties to put forward agenda items through the OIC. There was a lot of diplomatic crossfire between Pakistan's Foreign Office and the OIC and Saudi Arabia this year and also last year. And the Saudi dominance is clear. Saudi Arabia is the biggest donor to the OIC and other, mainly Muslim majority regional organizations. By virtue of that, it has maintained a great deal of control in international organizations. Malaysia and Turkey are, they are big actors in terms of their economies. They got frustrated with all what is happening with the Saudi dominance, and they wanted to get Pakistan on board for establishing another forum, which is not led by Saudi Arabia. This did not happen this time around, in my opinion. But next time the dynamics would be different. I think Pakistan might rethink to join it, because now Pakistan's relationship with the UAE and Saudi Arabia are completely at rock bottom, if I can say that, considering Pakistan has also started to repay loans to Saudi Arabia, which is very unprecedented. Giving billions of dollars back to Saudi Arabia by taking more loans from China, for example, because there is now this pressure from Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan wants to have some autonomy in terms of its foreign affairs.
Mr. Zahid, let's leave this discussion on a positive note then. Kindly enlighten us, what are the chances of Saudi and Iran coming on a common platform?
Chances at this stage are very minimal, I would say. I would have loved to end this interview on a positive note by saying that, they can have economic cooperation, they can have all other kinds of cooperation. Even after the Islamic Revolution, the Saudi-Iran relations were not this bad, and until before the 9/11, there was some level of cooperation, negotiations, and so on. So this shows that they do have a capacity and they do have interest to engage with each other. But the dynamics have altogether changed, unfortunately, with the change of leadership in Saudi Arabia, with now the current political dynamics in Iran as well. I think what countries like other Muslim countries and other Western powerful Western countries can do is they can restart that process of negotiations between Riyadh and Tehran. Imran Khan tried at the beginning of the year. He went to Tehran. He also went to Riyadh with the possibility of reaching some kind of agreement. Here we are talking about two big Muslim states who have very, very bad relations with each other. So the other countries want. Kuwait has also been interested in mediating. The Muslim countries have put some pressure on Iran and Saudi Arabia. But of course, they have to bring the whole war rhetoric down. I think the language is very aggressive on both sides. Their geopolitical struggles involving their proxies in the region also create a lot of insecurities, and that might not change in near future. But every journey starts from a single step. I think the first step should be the reinitiation of a dialogue or peace dialogues between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Mr. Zahid, thank you. Thank you for talking to me.
You're welcome. Thanks for the invitation.